Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another free lecture from IP Expert. Today we will talk about ASA basic configuration. This is a CCNA level session, and there are no special prerequisites for you to attend and to fully understand what we will be going over. We will talk about the basic stuff, such as how to initialize the firewall, how to bring up the interfaces, how to configure them, what is the default filtering behavior of the ASA, and also how to configure basic network address translation, and we will also play a little bit with the policies. Okay, so first thing that I want to show you here is the topology that I will be using in this demonstration. And we will have three routers that will emulate our inside DMZ and outside devices with the ASA in the middle. So I will be using those routers to show you the behavior of the ASA when no policy is configured and then when we finally apply the policies. So on the inside, it's going to be router 2, which is also configured with one of the loopbacks that I will use to emulate the internal subnet. And this is, let me take a look at the interface. Okay, so we've got 172.16.10, this is our inside network, and 10.1.1.0/24 are gonna be our inside users. So let's put it here. And then the loopback is 10.1.1/24. And then on the DMZ, we have router 4, and this is 172.16.20. And on the outside we will be using some public addresses. Router 5, and we have, I believe, the WAN1 for 30. It's 12.130.0/24. Okay, the ASA uses the 30 on all interfaces. 4 uses 4 and 2 uses 2. So as you can see on the command line, I also named those routers according to the part of the network where they belong to. So router 2 is called inside, 4 is DMZ, and 5 is outside, just in case that you forgot, that you don't see that topology. It's gonna basically streamline the whole demonstration. Okay, and I will be using ASDM for configuration of the ASA. The ASA is only configured with one interface at this point, which is the management port. So this is what I will use to access the firewall using ASDM. So this is going to be an HTTPS connection to the ASA. And the first thing that I will try to do here is going to be to initialize the firewall according to our network. So I want to bring all of the interfaces. I want to configure inside the DMZ, outside, assign IP addresses, and configure some other settings. Okay, so let's authenticate, and I'm gonna start with a so-called setup wizard, because there are two main ways, two general ways you can use to initialize the firewall. One is to manually configure the interfaces using the command line or ASDM, and the other option is to use a setup wizard. And this is something you can access from the configuration tab. Well, actually, pretty much all of the configuration options will be accessible from this configuration tab. So it's called Startup Wizard. So what I will do is that I will show you what things we can configure using this wizard. I will use it to configure just one interface, but I will show you all of the options that we can enable for this using this method. So I will say modify existing configuration, because as I said, I have the management interface already configured. And we will leave the host name set to ASA free, and the domain name is going to be set to ipexpert.com. You'll want to set a domain if you wanted to configure ASA for SSH access. Okay, I'm going to skip the privileged mode password. So we can go directly to the interfaces. And maybe just one interface I'm going to configure from here. It's going to be that gigabit Ethernet 0/0, which is going to be our inside interface. So it's going to be something from this 172.16.10.0/24 range, and specifically I'm going to assign that 30 in the 4th octet. Okay, so the first thing I want to assign an IP address, 172.16.10.30/24. Now, whenever you deal with interfaces with the basic setup, there are essentially 4 different things that you have to remember about, or 5, depending on the interface deployment mode selected. Like if you want to use physical interfaces, or maybe sub interfaces, which are logical ports. For the physical ones, you want to specify an IP address, you want to specify an alias for the interface, you need to specify a security level, and say no shut, which is when you want to bring the port up. If you want to configure sub-interfaces, the logical ones, you have to add a VLAN number, which is going to be then used in the, which is going to be then included in the frames sent by the ASA, so the switch knows what VLANs the frames should be sent to. But in our case, we will be using just the physical ports. This is the simplest deployment mode, so we will not specify any VLAN numbers. So I will assign IP address statically. Then the security level for inside, this is going to be our most secure interface. Set it to 100. The interface name, so that alias I mentioned, inside, and say I want to enable it. If you want to specify IPv6 addresses, you have to go over here. We will use IP version 4. Right, so say next. Do you want to configure any other interfaces? Well, yes, but not through the wizard. So we will skip this. And we will go to step number 5, which is to add static routes. I'm going to show you how to add routes manually. So I will also skip this one. We don't want to enable ASA, we don't want to enable DHCP server on the firewall. The routers we have that I will be using, they are configured with static addresses. Now, another thing you can set using the wizard is basic NAT configuration. Like when you want to change translate the internal ranges to something public. I will show you how to do this manually. A management access already configured to the management port. I said that I want to allow ASDM access from anyone. And then auto updates, we can skip it. And finally the summary, it says that we have configured the host name, domain name, inside interface, this was already configured, and management access was also in. So I will say finish, and let's take a look at the commands that the ASDM will now send to the ASA. So it says that it goes to the interface GigaWO and configures 4 different elements: IP address, security level, an alias, and no shut. So an alias is needed so the interface becomes active after you enable it. And security level, this one is pretty important because it is going to affect the default filtering behavior of the ASA. Okay, let's send the commands first. And let's finish that interface setup, initialization, and then I will tell you, I will go over that default filtering behavior of the ASA, which is going to be related to those security levels that we have configured. And also for the bidirectional communication, as we will see later, what is also going to be important is whether a particular packet was inspected by the firewall or not, because the default filtering behavior of the ASA it only affects traffic. Well, it affects traffic in both directions depending on the source interface where the session originated. But if you want to have bidirectional connections to be allowed, so the return packets to the original flow, you will have to, unless you want to play with access lists, you will also have to inspect the certain protocols. Well, we will see that UDP and TCP is inspected by default, and this is why we will be able to, for example, Telnet from the inside to outside. But when I try to ping from the inside to outside, the echo requests will go through based on the default filtering behavior of the ASA. But because this traffic was not inspected, return packets will hit the lower to higher rule, and they will be dropped. And we will talk about it later. So let's just finish with the interface setup. Let's go under interfaces. So now I'm showing you the manual method. Because everything that you can set using the wizard, you can also configure manually by navigating for those different menus here. So I went to the interfaces. We are still under configuration. And I need to configure two more. One for the DMZ, one for the outside. If you wanted to add some interface, for example, you would have to choose this option, add interface, and you have an option to specify the VLAN number. But once again, we will be using the physical ports only. So I will say added. And this is Giga1. So I will say that this is our DMZ with security level of 50. And then I will no-shot this interface and specify an IP address. 172.16.20.30 according to our topology /24. Okay, under advanced you can also set things such as MTU and configure MAC addresses. IPv6 addresses will be configured under this tab. Okay, so I'm going to say OK. So it says enabled 50 address, default MTU. Now one more for the outside. You go to security level is going to be set to 0. I will enable it and specify an IP address. 12.130.30/24. Okay, so we have all of the interfaces. I just need to send the commands to the ASA. And let's go back to the whiteboard for a second. Okay, so once again, the security levels that I have assigned, we have 100 for the inside, that we've got 50 on the DMZ and 0 on the outside. And a default behavior of the ASA is to allow traffic and when it comes from a higher security level interface to a lower one. Like, for example, from inside outside, because 100 is higher than 0, so this is going to be allowed by default. Same as from the DMZ to the outside in this direction. because we are coming from 50 then to 0. But if I were to say that, so I can also, by default, access the DMZ from the inside in this direction. So inside can access the DMZ and outside. DMZ can access outside, but outside, it is the lowest number here. So outside cannot access the DMZ, and it cannot access inside by default. If you want to allow communication from the outside in this network, you have to configure an access list and apply it to that interface. So this is what happens by default. And we can take a look at this on the CLI. Like from my inside device, let's say that I will try to telnet to the outside box. And we see that the connection is coming from the inside device. I should be able to telnet to DMZ box 172.16.20.4. Okay, same here. And I also should be able to telnet from the DMZ to the outside. So we see we also have connectivity. Now let's do one more thing on the ASVM. Let's go under firewall, actually device management, and let's enable logging. So I will go to the logging setup. I will enable logging on the ASA, and also say that I want to send all severity 4 and above messages to the console, which is basically enabling logging at the console, on the console at level 4. So based on the severity, this is going to be warnings. So we should see 2 commands will be sent to the ASA. Logging enabled and logging console warnings. Okay, and at this point, I can show you that when I try to telnet from the outside, for example, to the DMZ, 172.16.20, we see that the session, it didn't go through. And we see some log messages showing up on the ASA. It says inbound TCP connection denied from the outside router to the DMZ device, a SYN segment. And it says inbound, that this inbound here refers to the default filtering behavior of the ASA. Inbound is basically from lower security level interface to higher. So this is the inbound, outbound on the ASA is related to security levels. The outbound session is when this session originated on a higher security level and it is destined to something lower. But inbound means that we are coming from a less trusted network to more trusted network. Okay, so this is what happens by default. Now, another thing that I want to show you, I'm going to leave this default filtering behavior of the ASA for now. Let's do one more thing before I show you the inspection. Let's configure network address translation on this device. Because at this point, when you go back to the, we'll actually have to configure 2 things: static route and I also want to configure NAT in addition to that. Because I will say that my goal at this point, this is like a typical deployment, which you would see in a real design. You want to configure network address translation for your internal devices, so when the sessions go through the firewall, they will appear as they come from a public address. So the devices on the internet, they can reply to those boxes. So since we are using RFC 1918 range on the inside, the internal network is 10.1.1.0/24. I will say that I want to translate this whole subnet using path. So it's going to be port address translation, and I will be using the IP address of the ASA of the outside interface. This is first thing that we will do. Then second thing is going to be to tell ASA that this subnet exists and it is reachable via router 2, because at this point ASA doesn't have a route to this subnet. So if I were to ping from the ASA, we see that we don't have a route, we don't have connectivity. Okay, so maybe first thing, let's add a route. Let's go to the firewall. So configuration, then down to firewall. Excuse me, it's going to be actually under device management. No, it's going to be, is it going to be device setup? There should be an entry here for routing at under one of these three. It's actually device setup. So then go to routing and static routes. We want to add a single route via the inside. Okay, so let's say add. The interface is inside. This is 10.1.1.0/24. And the next hop is router 2. So our inside device 172.16.10.2. And this is IP version 4 route. Well, let's just add it. And send this to the ASA. So now I can access this loopback on the router 2. Also from router 2, when I say telnet to the outside, but from this loopback, we see that we have connectivity, but we are coming from 10.1.1.2. This is the original address of that interface. So normally if this was the internet, we would never be able to telnet or access those devices because this subnet is not non-routable. So we have to change the address to be something from the public range. And this is why I want to configure the network address translation. We need to go under firewall and then to net rules. We have two options to configure network address translation on the newer version of code on the ASA. You can use so-called ADONet, which is going to be useful for basic source translations. When you don't want to use any type of policies in your or special conditions in your translation rules. Manual net, the other option, is when you want to add some sort of policy or conditions other than just source address in the packet. So I will use that the simplest method, the ADONet, which is called network object net rule. It is called network object rule because we will be actually configuring it from within an object. So object in this case is gonna be our internal subnet. I will call it int users. This is 10.1.1/24 subnet. And under net, I can configure the translation. So since I said that I want to configure port address translation, this will be a dynamic path option where the translated address is one assigned to the outside interface of the ASA, 12.130.30. Now let's also go under advanced and specify that this translation rule is only going to be matched when the packets are coming from the inside. So this is inside to outside translation. When the internal devices want to access something on the outside, they will be, the packets will be path translated. Okay, so let's apply, send these commands, and let's test it. So another telnet from the inside to the outside box. I'm sourcing the traffic of that loopback, which emulates our internal users. But now when I say who, I'm supposed to access the device on the outside, and now source the loopback. So say who, and we see that I am now coming from 12.130.30 instead of the original address of 10.112. And we should be also able to see it on the ASA's command line when I say show XLink. So it says that there is a port address translation, a device with IP address 10.112 on the inside is translated on the outside to 12.130.30, and this is RI, which is port map, dynamic port map, the path translation. Okay, another thing that I want to do here is that I want to be able to access router 4 from the outside using Telnet. So I want to get to the router 4's command line from the outside, and I want to use a public address to access this device. So it's going to be another translation that I will be showing you. But the devices on the outside, they will be connecting to a non-Telnet port, something else than 23, like let's say 3023. This is what those devices on the outside will be connecting to. So let's say that, let me clean up this drawing a little bit. Okay, so let's say that router 4 is gonna be 12.134 on the outside, and I will be connecting to port 3023. So from router 5. When I telnet to 12.134 over 3023, I want to access router 4 using the telnet port. So I want to access router 4's command line. So it's going to be a static translation with port redirection, static path. We have to go back to the net rules and add another add-on-net statement, R4-telnet. Let's give it this name. Now the IP address of the original device, this is router 4, 172.16.24. This is a host, a single device. Static translation, translated address I said is going to be 12.134. And then go to the advanced. If this device is on the DMZ, the original router, translation is going to be done on the outside, and we also have to fill those service options. So it's going to be TCP, where the real port is 23. This is Telnet on router 4, and mapped one is 3023. Okay, so say OK. (12.134), and let's apply. Okay, so now the question is, will I be able to connect to this device with our current configuration? When I go to router 5 and try to telnet to 12.134.3023. And the answer is going to be no, I will not be able to connect because of the default filtering behavior of the ASA. So once again, we are coming from a lower to higher. We are coming from 0, and we are trying to access a device on the DMZ, which is 50. So this is not allowed by default. I have to modify my access list. I have to create an access list and apply it on the outside interface where I explicitly permit this communication. So we need to go under access rules. And let's take a look at just IPv4 entries. And take a look at, this is exactly what the ASA is telling me here. This is the default behavior of the ASA. It says that on the inside, the traffic is allowed when the destination is less secure interface. Same on the DMZ. But on the outside, there are no implicit rules. It is configured with 0, which is the least number, the lowest number here. So the communication is denied. We need to add an access list to the outside. So say add access rule on the outside, permit connections from anyone, where the destination is my, and now the question is going to be, what is the destination? Is it going to be the translated address or the original one? In the newer versions of the ASA code, it's always going to be that original address and the original port number. So the original one is 172.16.24. So this is my destination. A service is going to be the original port, so Telnet, TCP23. And OK. So source is anyone. Destination is my DMZ server, a Telnet, the original port, permit. Okay, so let's apply. You see it creates an access list, but in addition to that, it also applies that access list. This is because by default, there are no access lists configured on the firewall. Okay, so let's send those and test connectivity here. So one more Telnet, and this time we see that we are connected. The connection was originated by 12.135. Okay, and finally, one more thing that I'd like to show you here to finish this session is the inspection, default inspection behavior of the ASA. Because so far we have seen that the traffic is allowed based on the security levels, but the traffic is going to be allowed in one direction only if the session is not inspected, which is going to be the case for ICMP. Like if I were to, instead of issuing a telnet to the outside, which we know is allowed, if I try to ping this device, we see we don't have connectivity, but in fact we have unidirectional connectivity in this case. Because the ASA is allowing the, so this is our setup. We've got the ASA, router 2 and router 5. And we've got 100 here and 0 here, security levels. So I'm issuing pings from router 2, and they are allowed to, for the firewall, because I'm coming from a higher to lower. So this is by default allowed. So I should see on 5 that I'm getting the echo packets. Say debug IP ICMP. And let's send a few echoes more. So we see that 5 replies, which means that 5 is getting the requests. So the reason that I don't have connectivity on router 2, full connectivity, bidirectional connectivity, is that when the reply is coming from 5 and it is received by the ASA, it is now perceived as it comes from a lower to higher. which is by default blocked. So the question is now why the Telnet session is allowed in both directions. We see the prompt, but ICMP communication is not. And the answer is that a modular policy framework default configuration of the ASA, the MPF config, which is something you can take a look at, you can verify under the service policy rules. By default, there is one global policy that is affecting all packets traversing the ASA. You can edit it. And it is inspecting those protocols that are checked in this menu, such as DNS, FTP, the packets with IP options, and some voice stuff. Plus, it also inspects the TCP and UDP. The TCP and UDP packets are inherently inspected by the ASA. But since ICMP is neither TCP nor UDP, and it is not checked in this policy, it is not enabled, it means that ASA is not inspecting ICMP packets. So when the reply comes back from the outside, it doesn't have an entry in the connection table. Access list denies the communication or just the default behavior of the ASA, and the reply is not allowed to go through. So one solution is going to be to allow ICMP replies on the access list if you want to be able to get the replies on the inside. The other one is to enable inspection for ICMP packets. So now when the ASA sees the original request, let's send those commands. So from router 2 to 5, when it gets a reply back from 5, it will have an entry in the connection table, and this is going to tell the ASA that the packet should be allowed, so we should have connectivity on router 2. Now in this case, in both directions, which we do, because the traffic is now inspected. Okay, do you have any questions to this session, to the basic ASA setup for the interfaces, in NAT or access lists, MPF? Okay, if you don't have any questions, I would like to quickly remind you about other sources of free trainings from IP Expert. This demonstration and also any previous lectures, you can find them on the YouTube account. So youtube.com/IPExpertINC. There are a couple of really useful blog articles. You can find them on the blog. And also Facebook. We've got a really large group on Facebook for security, which was designed to help people to prepare to the CCIE exam. So not necessarily to, it's not specific to CCNA, CCNP, but if you are at this level, you're more welcome to join this group. You have any questions related to CCNA, CCNP, or CCIE level, just go ahead and submit those questions. You just have to ask me to add you to this group. Thank you for attending.